speaker for this morning is Dr. Edward Edinger. Dr. Edinger is a practicing psychiatrist and analyst in New York City. He's a training analyst in the New York Institute of Analytical Psychology, and he's the chairman of that training institute. He's the author of the well-known book, Ego and Archetype, the author of many essays and articles that have appeared different places, including scholarly works on Herman Melville and Melville's Moby Dick. And he has currently been working on a book dealing with alchemical procedures and alchemical imagery. He also lectures widely to both professional and non-professional audiences. Dr. Edinger's style, I think it's fair to say, can be described as serious, succinct, and witty. For me, this style was best exemplified when on one occasion he summed up the distinction between Freudians and Jungians as follows. The Freudians talk about sex, the Jungians conjunct. In the spirit of another of our speakers here, we might go on with this. When the Freudians talk about sex, the Jungians conjunct. Whenever the Freudians talk about sex, whenever the Jungians conjunct, the Freudians, and so on. I think another thing we can say about Jung and Jungians is that they talk a lot about meaning. Exactly what the Freudians do at this point, I will not indulge myself to speculate on. But the theme of meaning has not, it seems to me, been absent from this conference. It appeared, for example, in James Hillman's definition of archetypal psychology as a psychology that works to make things matter by uncovering hidden conjunctions and obscure relations. So Dr. Edinger's topic for this morning, the new myth of meaning, is not unrelated to a hidden theme of this conference. And since, according to William James and Jung and now James Hillman, meaning derives from conjunctive relations, for example, in Jung's idea of synchronicity, I'm sure that Dr. Edinger's talk will itself this morning be an event of meaning. So with that, I give you Dr. Edinger.
Give me a moment while I prepare here. Last night, while I was watching Punch and Judy, I had a few thoughts. One of them was I was reminded of Jung's definition of the theater. He described the theater as the place where we work out our complexes collectively. And I thought I noticed that going on last night. That then led to some further thoughts about the perils of being a performer, since one really is purposely trying to evoke projections, and projections come from complexes. And as you know, it used to be common that performers would be pelted with one thing or another, flowers maybe, or rotten vegetables maybe, very pelting, signifying the projections, positive or negative, that they were evoking by the nature of their performance. Well, to a lesser degree, I think speakers run the same perils, getting either positive projections, which they, if they take them seriously, they tend to then puff themselves up a bit and think that there may be more than they really are. Or alternatively, negative projections, in which the reverse takes place. So I wanted to mention this before I start because just possibly what I have to say may evoke some reactions in you. And if they're of some warmth, either positively or negatively, I would remind you that they probably come from your own individual complexes rather than from me. Even boredom is a symptom of touching a complex. So, with those provisos, I'm going to proceed. It's very true what Murray Stein said concerning the term meaning. Meaning, I think that term is a kind of symbol for me. I read somewhere that Kenneth Clark, when he was initially approached by the BBC to do a series on history of culture, wasn't at all interested in it. I think he turned it down. But then a second approach was made, and at that time someone happened to use the word civilization. And we want you to give us something on civilization. Well, that word caught him. And on the basis of the symbolic import of that word, as we know it, to a symbol is a transformer and transmitter of energies. On the basis of that symbolism that that word carried for Kenneth Clark, he produced those 13 sequences, which are really quite impressive. Meaning, to a lesser degree, has the same effect on me. It's a symbolic transformer of energy, and that's why I must use that word in this title, even though the title could do without it. As I proceed, I think you will come to realize that another word that also carries a special symbolic import for me is the word consciousness. So to proceed. History and anthropology teach us that a human society cannot long survive unless its members are psychologically contained within a central living myth. Such a myth, when it's operating correctly, provides the individual his reason for being. To the ultimate questions of human existence, it provides answers which satisfy the most developed and discriminating members of the society. And if the creative intellectual minority is satisfied and in harmony with the prevailing myth, then the other layers of society, in all likelihood, will follow its lead and may even be spared a direct encounter with that fateful question of the meaning of life. I think it's evident to thoughtful people that Western society no longer has a viable functioning myth. Indeed, all the major world cultures are approaching to a greater or lesser extent the condition of mythlessness. I think of the breakdown of a central myth as like the shattering of a vessel containing a precious essence. The fluid is spilled out and drains away and is soaked up by the surrounding undifferentiated matter. Meaning is lost. In its place, primitive and atavistic contents are reactivated. Differentiated values disappear and are replaced by the elemental motivations of power and pleasure. Or else the individual is exposed to emptiness and despair. With the loss of awareness of a transpersonal reality, usually called God, the inner and the outer anarchies of competing personal desires take over. The loss of a central myth brings about a truly apocalyptic condition. And this, I think, is the state of modern man. Our poets have long recognized this fact. Yeats gave it stark expression in his poem, The Second Coming, which I want to read to you because I think of it as a kind of modern scripture of the collective psyche. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. hardly are those words out when a vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. This was first published in 1921. I think it's astonishing in the way it succinctly strikes the major themes concerning the current state of the collective psyche. The magic circle of our mandala has broken, and meaning has escaped. The falcon has lost the link with its creator, releasing primitive levels of the unconscious from control. And the ensuing chaos calls forth in compensation the birth of a new central psychic dominant. But what will it be? Antichrist? The allusion to the Sphinx suggests that we must once again face the riddle of the Sphinx and ask ourselves most seriously, what is the meaning of life? It's the loss of our containing myth, which is the root cause of our current individual and social distress. And nothing less than the discovery of a new central myth will solve the problem, both for the individual and for society. In my view, a new myth is in the making. And Jung was keenly aware of that fact. One datum that indicates that idea is the following. A Jungian analyst once had this dream. The analyst is Max Zeller of Los Angeles. Quote, "A temple of vast dimensions was in the process of being built. As far as I could see, ahead, behind, right, and left, there were incredible numbers of people building on gigantic pillars. I, too, was building on a pillar. The whole building process was in its very beginning, but the foundation was already there, the rest of the building was starting to go up, and I and many others were working on it." End the dream. He took this dream to Jung, and reports that Jung made the following remark about it. Quote, "Ja." You know, quote continues, you know that in the temple, that this is the temple we all build on. We don't know the people, because believe me, they build in India and China and in Russia and all over the world. That is the new religion. You know how long it will take until it is built? He asked Max Zeller. Max Zeller says, "How should I know?" And he says, "I know." Jung says, "About 600 years." And Max says, "How do you know?" And he says, "I know it from my dreams and the dreams of others." Jung was the first to formulate the problem of modern man as mythlessness. And as with so many of his discoveries, he found it first of all himself. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he describes that after the publication of Symbols of Transformation in 1912, he had a moment of unusual clarity and thought, quote, "Now you possess a key to mythology and are free to unlock all the gates of the unconscious psyche. But then something whispered in me, why open all the gates? And promptly the question arose of what, after all, I had accomplished. I had explained the myths of peoples of the past. I had written a book about the hero, the myth in which man has always lived. But in what myth does man live nowadays? In the Christian myth, the answer might be. Do you live in it? I asked myself. To be honest, the answer was no. For me, it is not what I live by. Then do we no longer have any myth? No, evidently we no longer have any myth. But then what is your myth? The myth in which you live. At this point, the dialogue with myself became uncomfortable, and I stopped thinking. I'd reached a dead end. End of quote. But Jung later found his myth. And it's the thesis of this paper that just as Jung's discovery of his own mythlessness paralleled the mythless condition of modern society, so Jung's discovery of his own individual myth will prove to be the first emergence of our new collective myth. In fact, it's my conviction that as we gain historical perspective, it will become evident that Jung is an epochal man. I mean by this, a man whose life inaugurates a new age in cultural history. The epochal man is the first to experience and fully to articulate a new mode of existence. His life thus takes on an objective, impersonal meaning, becomes a paradigm, the prototypical life of the new age, and hence exemplary. Jung was aware of this fact concerning his own life. Speaking of his confrontation with the unconscious, he writes, quote, "It was then that I ceased to belong to myself alone, ceased to have the right to do so. From then on, my life belonged to the generality." End quote. The fact that Jung's personal life belonged to the generality was demonstrated by the uncanny parallelism between the critical episodes of his inner life and the collective crises of Western civilization. His first major confrontation with the unconscious occurred simultaneously with the collective catastrophe of World War I. From 1914 to 1918, while the nations of Western Christendom were engaged in a brutal external conflict, Jung endured the inner equivalent of the World War, withstanding and integrating the upheaval of the collective unconscious from within. A few years before, William James had called for a moral equivalent of war. What Jung achieved was a psychological equivalent of war, by which the conflict of the opposites was contained within the individual psyche. Again, during World War II, Jung had his supreme revelation of the unconscious, his visions of the conjunctio, at the time of a grave illness in 1944. And we're told that by D-Day, June 6, 1944, although still hospitalized, he was well into convalescence. I think almost all the important episodes of Jung's life can be seen as paradigmatic of the new mode of being, which is the consequence of living by a new myth. This is not the place to explore that further, however. Instead, I want to consider the nature of the new myth, which he discovered and which released him from his mythless condition. He got a glimpse of his new myth while visiting the Pueblo Indians in the southwestern United States in the early part of 1925. He succeeded in gaining the confidence of a chief of the Taos Pueblo named Mountain Lake. In his memories, Jung describes his conversation with Mountain Lake, and I quote, Mountain Lake said, "The Americans want to stamp out our religion. Why can they not let us alone? What we do not only for ourselves, but for the Americans also. Yes, we do it for the whole world. Everyone benefits by it." I could observe from his excitement that he was alluding to some extremely important element of his religion. I therefore asked him, "You think then that what you do in your religion benefits the whole world?" He replied with great animation, "Of course, if we did not do it, what would become of the world?" And with a significant gesture, he pointed to the sun. I felt that we were approaching extremely delicate ground here, verging on the mysteries of the tribe. "After all," he said, "we are a people who live on the roof of the world. We are the sons of Father Sun. And with our religion, we daily help our Father to go across the sky. We do this not only for ourselves, but for the whole world. If we were to cease practicing our religion, in 10 years the sun would no longer rise. Then it would be night forever." I then realized on what the dignity, the tranquil composure of the individual Indian was founded. It springs from his being a son of the sun. His life is cosmologically meaningful, for he helps the Father and Preserver of all life in his daily rise and descent. End of quote. This belief of the Pueblos, that they help their Father the Sun to rise each day and make his transit of the heavens, turns out to be a primitive, naive version of what was to become Jung's new myth. Later, in 1925, while traveling in Africa, Jung had another experience that crystallized the formulation of this myth more explicitly. I must quote it fairly fully because it's so important. Quote, "From Nairobi, we used a small Ford to visit the Athi Plains, a great game preserve. From a low hill in this broad savanna, a magnificent prospect opened out to us. To the very brink of the horizon, we saw gigantic herds of animals, gazelle, antelope, gnu, zebra, warthog, and so on. Grazing, heads nodding. The herds moved forward like slow rivers. There was scarcely any sound save the melancholy cry of a bird of prey. This was the stillness of the eternal beginning, the world as it had always been in the state of non-being, for until then, no one had been present to know that it was this world. I walked away from my companions until I put them out of sight, and savored the feeling of being entirely alone. There I was now, the first human being to recognize that this was the world, but who did not know that in this moment he had first really created it. There, the cosmic meaning of consciousness became overwhelmingly clear to me. What nature leaves imperfect, the art perfects, say the optimists. Man, I, in an invisible act of creation, put the stamp of perfection on the world by giving it objective existence. My old Pueblo friend came to mind. He thought that the raison d'etre of his Pueblo had been to help their father, the sun, to cross the sky each day. I had envied him for the fullness of meaning in that belief, and had been looking about without hope for a myth of my own. Now I knew what it was, and knew even more, that man is indispensable for the completion of creation. That, in fact, he himself is the second creator of the world, who alone has given to the world its objective existence, without which, unheard, unseen, silently eating, giving birth, dying, heads nodding through the millions of years, it would have gone on in the profoundest night of non-being down to its unknown end. Human consciousness created objective existence and meaning, and man found his indispensable place in the great process of being." End of quote. In answer to Job, he puts it more succinctly, quote, "Existence is only real when it is consciousness to somebody. That is why the Creator needs conscious man, even though from sheer unconsciousness he would like to prevent him from becoming conscious." And one more quote, from another place. "Man's task is to become conscious of the contents that press upwards from the unconscious. Neither should he persist in his unconsciousness, nor remain identical with the unconscious elements of his being, thus evading his destiny, which is to create more and more consciousness. As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. It may even be assumed that just as the unconscious affects us, so the increase in our consciousness affects the unconscious." These are some of the major statements about Jung concerning his discovery of the new myth. Now I fear that to many, especially those without personal experience of the unconscious, these statements may be hard to comprehend fully. The remainder of this paper will be an effort to make the new myth that these statements allude to somewhat more understandable. The essential new idea is that the purpose of human life is the creation of consciousness. The key word is consciousness. But unfortunately, it's not at all clear what the word means. As with all fundamental aspects of the psyche, it eludes our grasp as soon as we try to define and contain it. The best I can do in approaching it is to use an oblique symbolic approach. For those of you that are interested, I have treated the whole idea of consciousness more fully in a paper called The Meaning of Consciousness that was published in the Quadrant, the journal of the CG Jung Foundation, for fall 1975. The etymology of the word is helpful. It derives from con or cum, meaning with or together, and skiri, to know or to see. Thus it has the same derivation as conscience. So the root meaning of both consciousness and conscience is knowing with or seeing with an other. In contrast, the word science, which also derives from skiri, means simple knowing, that is, knowing without witness. We learn from this that the phenomena of consciousness and conscience are somehow related, and that the experience of consciousness is made up of the two factors knowing and witness. Knowing requiring the presence of an other, or in other words, in a setting of two-ness. Symbolically, the number 2 refers to the opposites. We thus reach the conclusion that consciousness is somehow born out of the experience of the opposites. And this same conclusion is reached by other means as well, as we shall see. I understand consciousness to be a substance, a psychic material that is usually, but not always, invisible and intangible to the senses. The problem in understanding such things concerns the word psyche and psychic. So I can speak of a psychic material or a psychic substance, and that won't convey anything unless there's some experience to be attached to the word psyche. Until one has experienced the reality of the psyche, he can follow this discussion no farther. But given that experience of psychic reality, then it's not so hard to grasp the idea of a psychic substance. We could say that all psychic contents have substance if they're experienced as objectively real. What then distinguishes the psychic substance of consciousness? I would say that consciousness is psychic substance connected to an ego. Or, more precisely, psychic contents which are potential entities, potential substances, become actualized and substantial when they make connection with an ego. That is, when they enter an individual's conscious awareness and become an accepted item of that individual's personal responsibility. Let me say that again, because I think it's important. Psychic contents become actualized and substantial when they make connection with an ego. That is, when they enter an individual's conscious awareness and become an accepted item of that individual's personal responsibility. The process whereby a series of psychic contents, complexes, archetypal images, make connection with an ego and thereby generate this psychic substance of consciousness, this whole process is what's called individuation. And this process has as its most characteristic feature the encounter of opposites. Usually first experienced as ego as opposed to the unconscious, the I as opposed to the not I, the subject as opposed to the object, myself as opposed to the other. But we can say from this that whenever one is experiencing the conflict between contrary attitudes, or whenever his personal desire or idea is being contested by an other, either from inside or from outside, the possibility of creating a new increment of consciousness exists. We can probably all recall experiences of inner or outer conflict which were resolved creatively and were accompanied by a sense of satisfaction and life enhancement after some period of estrangement from a friend or external antagonist or from one's inner world, and after serious efforts to confront and deal with that estrangement, if a resolution is achieved, an enhancement of energy is characteristically a consequence. And such experiences, I think, would be examples of the creation of small increments of consciousness. And such encounters, when they are sought deliberately and reflected upon systematically, become an essential feature of the individuation process, which is a kind of continual Ausline Andersetzen, coming to terms or clashing with contrasting contents with an other or an opposite to the given standpoint of the ego. Because it's certainly true that in the process of creating consciousness, we are at first thrown back and forth between opposing moods and attitudes. Because each time the ego identifies with one side of a pair of opposites, the unconscious, which can manifest either inside or outside, the unconscious will confront him with its contrary. And very gradually, the individual, if he sticks at it, becomes able to experience opposite viewpoints simultaneously. And with this capacity, consciousness is created. There are a number of mythological and symbolic ideas that refer quite explicitly to the creation of consciousness. I want to mention just a few briefly. For instance, the Gnostic idea of light scattered in the darkness, requiring laborious collection to be gathered together, is an example of the creation of consciousness. There's a grand Manichaean image of the zodiac as a great light wheel. It was thought of along the analogy of a water wheel. The idea was that as this great wheel turns and dips under the earth into the darkness, it gathers whatever particles of light has been lost in the darkness in its buckets, and then as it swings up, it transfers those buckets of light to the moon and onto the sun. Beautiful image of symbolically representing the creation of consciousness. The Kabbalah of Isaac Luria has profound symbolism of the same nature. According to this system, at the beginning of creation, God poured his divine light into bowls or vessels, but some of the vessels could not stand the impact of the light. They broke, and the light was spilled. Salvation of the world will now require the recollection of that spilled light and the restitution of the broken vessels. Again, an image of the creation of consciousness. The most outstanding symbolism pertaining to this whole theme is found in alchemy. Although the texts are confused and obscure, the basic idea of alchemy is quite simple. The idea was the alchemist must find the right original material to start his work on, so-called prima materia. He must then subject it to the proper series of operations in the alchemical vessel, and if he does so, he will achieve his goal, which is the production of a mysterious and powerful entity, usually called the Philosopher's Stone. We now know that this is symbolism referring to the individuation process, and that the Philosopher's Stone represents the realization of the self, which could also be said, described as the consciousness of wholeness. And a crucial feature of the creation of the Philosopher's Stone is that it is a union of opposites. It's a product of a conjunctio often symbolized by the union of the red king and the white queen. These two figures standing for any or all of the pairs of opposites. The alchemical myth tells us that consciousness is created by the union of opposites. We've gotten the same idea from examining the etymology of the word consciousness, and we learn the same lesson from the dreams of individuals. For example, let me give you the dream of a middle-aged woman. The woman dreamed that she went into an underground cavern that was divided into rooms containing stills and other mysterious-looking chemical apparatus. Two scientists were working over the final process of a prolonged series of experiments, which they hoped to bring to a successful conclusion with her help. The end product was to be in the form of golden crystals, which were to be separated from the mother liquid resulting from the many previous solutions and distillations. While the chemists worked over the vessel, the dreamer and her lover lay together in an adjoining room. their sexual embrace supplying the energy essential for the crystallization of the priceless golden substance. End of dream. It's quite interesting that there is an alchemical text that is almost an exact parallel to this dream. It reads as follows: Do ye not see that the complexion of a man is formed out of a soul and body? Thus also must ye conjoin these, because the philosophers, when they prepared matters and conjoined spouses mutually in love with each other, behold, there ascended from them a golden water. See, in each case, the basic image is that out of a sexual union, a golden substance is produced. In one case, golden crystals, in the other case, golden water. And I think these golden crystals and golden water can be understood as the essence of consciousness, synonymous with the self. Now, contrary to the implications of the erotic imagery in this dream, in this text, the conjunctio of opposites is not generally a pleasant process. More often it's felt as a crucifixion. The cross can be thought of as a union of the horizontal and the vertical, two contrary directional movements. And to be nailed to such a conflict can be a scarcely endurable agony. Augustine makes an amazingly explicit identification between the erotic conjunctio and Christ's crucifixion. He writes, Like a bridegroom, Christ went forth from his chamber. He went out with a presage of his nuptials into the field of the world. He came to the marriage bed of the cross, and there, in mounting it, he consummated his marriage, and he joined the woman to himself forever. End quote. I think the union of opposites in the vessel of the ego is the essential feature of the creation of consciousness. Consciousness is the third thing that emerges out of the conflict of two-ness. Out of the ego as the subject versus the ego as the object. Out of the ego as active agent versus the ego as passive victim. Out of the ego as praiseworthy and good versus the ego as damnable and bad. Out of the conflict of mutually exclusive duties. Out of all such paralyzing conflicts can emerge the third transcendent condition, which is a new quantum of consciousness. This way of putting it reveals the fact that the symbolism of the Trinity refers psychologically to the creation of consciousness. Father and Son, like God and man, are opposites which collide on the cross. The Holy Spirit, as the reconciling third, emerges from that collision, proceeding from both the Father and the Son. Thus, the Holy Spirit, as Paraclete, can only come after the death of the Son. That is, consciousness comes as the fruit of the conflict of two-ness. Therefore, Christ could say, quote, "It is to your advantage that I go away. For if I do not go away, the Counselor, the Paraclete, will not come to you. But if I go, I will send him to you. And when he comes, he will convince the world of sin and of righteousness and of judgment." In other words, he will make clear the nature of the opposites and their resolution. Understood psychologically, these statements refer to the time when individual egos will become potential vessels for the transpersonal value of consciousness. This is what Jung has to say on that subject. Quote, "The future indwelling of the Holy Spirit amounts to a continuing incarnation of God. Christ, as the begotten Son of God and pre-existing mediator, is a firstborn and a divine paradigm which will be followed by further incarnations of the Holy Ghost in the empirical man." End of quote. The biblical statements regarding the Paraclete thus anticipate the new myth which sees each individual ego, as potentially a vessel to carry transpersonal consciousness. What the Lord said about Paul may eventually apply to all. Quote, he is a chosen vessel unto me to bear my name. The image of the ego as a vessel leads to the important idea of being a carrier of consciousness, or in other words, an incarnation of transpersonal meaning. In my view, there are two main archetypal figures that have represented this idea in world culture, namely Buddha and Christ. I think we're fortunate to have two such figures. With two comes the possibility of comparison and objectivity. As long as there is but one figure embodying a supreme value, he can only be worshipped but not understood. With the presence of two, we can discover the separate third thing which they both share. Understanding and greater awareness then becomes possible. In my view, what Christ and Buddha have in common is the idea of being a carrier of consciousness. Characteristically, the image emerging in the West represents the standpoint of the ego, and that deriving from the East speaks from the standpoint of the self. Together, they reveal a pair of opposites. On the one hand, the crucified Christ. On the other hand, the meditating Buddha, representing consciousness as agony and consciousness as tranquil bliss. Total acceptance of the bondage to matter on the one hand, and total transcendence of the world on the other. United, they are a picture of the two sides of the carrier of consciousness. The idea of the individual as a vessel for consciousness brings to mind the symbolism of the Holy Grail. As the container for Christ's blood, the Grail carries the divine essence extracted from Christ by his ultimate experience of the opposites, the conjunctio crucifixion. In many respects, the blood of Christ corresponds symbolically to the Holy Spirit as Paraclete, because just as the Holy Spirit is to be incarnated in empirical man, so the blood of Christ is to find a containing vessel in the psyche of the individual, thereby creating for itself a Holy Grail. On the basis of our emerging knowledge of the unconscious, the traditional image of God has been enlarged. Traditionally, God has been pictured as all-powerful and all-knowing. Divine providence was seen as guiding all things according to the inscrutable but benevolent divine purpose. The extent of divine awareness did not receive much attention. The new myth enlarges the God image by introducing explicitly the additional feature of the unconsciousness of God. His omnipotence, omniscience, and divine purpose are not always known to him. He needs man's capacity to know him in order to know himself. In one sense, this indicates a renewed awareness of the reality of the less differentiated, jealous, and wrathful God of the Old Testament, with whom man must remonstrate, and with whom in the Old Testament many figures did remonstrate. The divine opposites that were separated by Christianity into the eternal antagonists, Christ and Satan, are now beginning to be reunited consciously in the vessel of the modern psyche. The new myth postulates that the created universe and its most exquisite flower, man, make up a vast enterprise for the creation of consciousness. And also that the sum total of consciousness created by each individual in his lifetime is deposited as a permanent addition in the collective treasury of the archetypal psyche. Jung alludes to this idea in the following passage where he is speaking of the psychotherapist, and I quote, "He is not just working for this particular patient, who may be quite insignificant, but for himself as well and his own soul. And in so doing, he is perhaps laying an infinitesimal grain in the scales of humanity's soul. Small and invisible, as this contribution may be, it is yet an opus magnum. End quote. Certain mythical images seem to suggest that accomplishments in the personal earthly life are transferred to the divine or archetypal realm. For instance, in early Egyptian religion, the dead were thought to be turned into stars or companions of the sun. James Breasted writes as follows, quote, "In the splendor of the mighty heavens, the Nile dweller saw the host of those who had preceded him. Thither they had flown as birds, rising above all foes of the air, and received by Ra as the companions of his celestial bark. They now swept across the sky as eternal stars." Similar imagery occurs in Christian symbolism, in which the righteous, after resurrection, will ascend to heaven. Thus, Paul writes, quote, "I will tell you something that has been secret, that we are not all going to die, but we shall all be changed. This will be instantaneous, in the twinkling of an eye, when the last trumpet sounds. It will sound, and the dead will be raised, imperishable, and we shall be changed as well, because our present perishable nature must put on immortality." Also, the figure of the apocalyptic Christ makes a similar promise in Revelation. Quote, "He who is victorious, I will make him a pillar in the temple of my God. He shall never leave it, and I will write the name of my God upon him, and the name of the city of my God, that new Jerusalem which is coming down out of heaven from my God, and my own name." Understood psychologically, these texts refer to a transfer or translation from the temporal personal life of the ego to the eternal archetypal realm. So presumably, the essential accomplishments of egohood, its total of accumulated consciousness, is deposited by means of a final sublimatio in the collective archetypal treasury of humanity's soul. Jung seems to be saying the same thing when he describes the visions he had when on the verge of death. Quote, "I had the feeling that everything was being sloughed away. Nevertheless, something remained. It was as if I now carried along with me everything I had ever experienced or done, everything that had happened around me. I consisted of my own history, and I thought with great certainty, this is what I am." Dreams sometimes refer to this idea of depositing the fruits of one's effort in a treasury. I give an example of such a dream in Ego and Archetype. If you're interested, you can look it up on page 218. Based on the idea of the communion of saints, Catholic theology has also elaborated a treasury image, the idea of a treasure of merits, which have been accumulated by the lives of Christ and the saints. This treasure of merits is described as follows by the Catholic theologian, quote, "If merit, properly so called, is not directly communicable between members of the Christian society, at least satisfaction can be transferred, almost as a man can pay a friend's debt. The infinite satisfaction of our Lord and the superabundant satisfaction of the Virgin Mary and the saints form a treasure which the Church guards and administers, drawing upon it for the payment of the debts remitted to the faithful by indulgences." End quote. This theological myth can now be understood as an early formulation of the historical process whereby the psychic accomplishments of individuals are transferred to the collective archetypal psyche. The new myth postulates that no authentic consciousness achieved by an individual is lost. Each increment augments the collective treasury. This will be the modern, more modest version of the idea of having an immortal soul. Milton seems to be dealing with the same idea in these lines from Lycidas, which were written when he was only 27 years old, and I've never adjusted myself to that fact. Fame is the spur that the clear spirit doth raise, that last infirmity of noble mind, to scorn delights and live laborious days. But the fair guerdon, when we hope to find and think to burst out into sudden blaze, comes the blind fury with the abhorred shears and slits the thin-spun life. But not the praise, Phoebus replied, and touched my trembling ears. Fame is no plant that grows on mortal soil, nor in the glistering foil set off to the world, nor in broad rumor lies, but lives and spreads aloft by those pure eyes and perfect witness of all judging Jove, as he pronounces lastly on each deed. Of so much fame in heaven expect thy meed. Fame, as here used by Milton, corresponds to those fruits of the ego life which are translated to the eternal realm and are deposited in the collective soul. Such a fame does not grow on mortal soil. In other words, it does not depend on being known by men, but it exists in heaven, the archetypal realm. Fame of this sort would correspond to Milton's description of a good book, the precious life blood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. The fact that our age is a time of death and rebirth for a central myth is indicated by the dreams and upheavals from the unconscious of many individuals. Depth psychotherapists who work with the products of the unconscious are in a unique position to observe the turmoil of the collective psyche. Apocalyptic imagery is not uncommon. I want to present one remarkable example of such a dream. I give you no personal association, no personal information about the dreamer, because I consider it irrelevant in this context. I take it almost totally to be describing a collective reality. He's an effective, well-developed, and highly functioning person, I'll say that much. Quote, I'm walking along what appears to be the Palisades overlooking all of New York City. I'm walking with an anima figure who is unknown to me. We are both being led by a man who is our guide. New York City is in a rubble. The world, in fact, has been destroyed. All of New York is just one heap of rubble. There are fires everywhere. Thousands of people are running in every direction frantically. The Hudson River has overflowed many areas of the city. Smoke is billowing up everywhere. As far as I can see, the land has been leveled. It was twilight. Fireballs were in the sky, heading for the earth. It was the end of the world. Total destruction of everything that man and his civilization had built up. The cause of this great destruction was a race of giants. Giants who had come from outer space, from the far reaches of the universe. In the middle of the rubble, I could see two of them sitting. They were casually scooping up people by the handful and eating them. All of this was done with the same nonchalance that we have when we sit down at the table and eat grapes by the handful. The sight was awesome. Our guide explained that the giants came from different planets and live harmoniously and peacefully together. He said that the giants landed in flying saucers. The fireballs were other landings. In fact, the Earth as we know it was conceived by this race of giants in the beginning of time. They cultivated our civilization like we cultivate vegetables in a hothouse. The Earth was their hothouse, so to speak. And now they have returned to reap the fruits they had sown. But there was a special occasion for this, which I only learned of later. I was saved because I had slightly high blood pressure. If I had normal blood pressure, or if my blood pressure was too high, I would have been eaten like almost all the others. Because I have slightly high blood pressure, I am chosen to go through this ordeal, and if I pass the ordeal, I would become like my guide, a saver of souls. We walked for an extraordinary long time, witnessing all the cataclysmic destruction. Then, before me, I saw a huge golden throne, brilliant as the sun, impossible to view straight on. On the throne sat a king and his queen of the race of giants. They were the intelligences behind the destruction of our planet. The ordeal, in addition to witnessing the world's destruction, the task I had to perform was to climb up this staircase until I was at their level, face to face with them. This was probably to be done in stages. I started climbing. It was long and very difficult. My heart was pounding very hard. I was frightened, but I knew I had to accomplish this task. I woke up from the dream, perspiring heavily. Later, I realized that the destruction of the earth by the race of giants was a wedding feast for the newly united king and queen. This was the special occasion and the extraordinary feeling I had about the king and queen. End of dream. I would suggest that dreams of this sort will go to make up the scriptures of the new myth. This is not a personal dream and should not be interpreted personalistically. It's a collective dream expressing the state of the collective psyche. 8 days before his death, Jung spoke of having had a vision in which a large part of the world was destroyed. But he added, thank God, not all of it. Years before, he had written of, quote, the mood of universal destruction and renewal that has set its mark on our age. This mood makes itself felt everywhere, politically, socially, and philosophically. We are living in what the Greeks called the kairos, the right moment, for a metamorphosis of the gods, of the fundamental principles and symbols. End quote. The dream I presented portrays this mood Jung speaks of universal destruction and renewal. And strikingly, it uses the same image of harvest as does Revelation, where at one point we read, one angel says to another, quote, put your sickle in and reap. Harvest time has come, and the harvest of the earth is ripe. Then the one sitting in the clouds set his sickle to work on the earth, and the earth's harvest was reaped. 14th chapter of Revelation. Now, what does it mean to be eaten by giants, or to be harvested by angels? It means, I think, that one has been swallowed up by archetypal, non-human dynamisms. The autonomous ego, which maintains a separate stance over and against instinct and archetype, which is the sine qua non of consciousness, in such a case has fallen into a fatal identification with the archetypes and been devoured by them. For the individual, this will mean either psychosis or criminal psychopathy. For society, it means structural disintegration and general collective demoralization, brought about by the loss of the central myth which had supported and justified the burdensome task of being human. In Yeats' words, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. In other words, they've been swallowed up by giants. The dreamer was saved from this fate because he had slightly high blood pressure. Now, this was not an external fact, and there were no personal associations to it. So we are left with general symbolism. Blood is the life essence, but in particular it refers to the affect life, desirousness, passion, intensity. Passionate intensity is dangerous, as Yeats implies in his phrase, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed. Blood pressure has gotten high. In other words, too high a blood pressure would perhaps indicate a greater intensity of primitive affect than can be assimilated by the ego. And such a person then would be consumed by the primitive archetypal energies of the giants as soon as he made contact with them. Normal blood pressure, on the other hand, would suggest a bland lack of reaction to abnormal times. We might say that it is correct, so to speak, for modern man to be disturbed, to have slightly high blood pressure. It indicates his inner alarm system is still intact, and there is still some chance for him, because his anxiety will spur him to reflection and effort that may be life-saving. On the contrary, a complacent attitude lulls one into a false sense of security, so that he then is completely unprepared for the encounter with the activated collective unconscious, symbolized by the invasion of the giants. The climbing of the staircase belongs to the alchemical symbolism of sublimatio. This operation involves the transfer of material from the bottom of the flask to the top through volatilization. Something is sublimated. Psychologically, it refers to the process whereby personal, particular problems, conflicts, and happenings are understood from a height, seen from a larger perspective, under the aspect of eternity, so to speak. Once the staircase has been climbed, the dreamer tells us that he will meet the enthroned king and queen face to face. This, I think, is a profound image of the process of encountering and enduring the union of opposites. The climbing of those stairs is a laborious task, as the dream makes clear. But evidently, it's the only way to avoid being consumed by the activated archetypes. This experience of the opposites, it's always initially experienced as a very painful and paralyzing conflict. But if one patiently and perseveringly endures and works on such conflicts, climbing the steps one by one, this promotes the creation of consciousness and may eventually lead to the glimpse of the self as a conjunctio, namely the level of seeing the united king and queen face to face. As Jung says, quote, "All opposites are of God. Therefore, man must bend to this burden, and in so doing, he finds that God, in his oppositeness, has taken possession of him, incarnated himself in him. He becomes a vessel filled with divine conflict." This is precisely the divine service which man can render to God. End quote. And this is also, according to this dream, what is required for salvation. Another feature of the new myth is its capacity to unify the various current religions of the world. By seeing all functioning religions as living expressions of individuation symbolism, that is, the process of creating consciousness, the new myth provides an authentic basis for a true ecumenical attitude. The new myth will not be one more religious myth in competition with all the others for man's allegiance. Rather, it will elucidate and verify every functioning religion by giving more conscious and comprehensive expression to its essential meaning. The new myth can be understood and lived in several different ways. Within one of the great religious communities, such as Catholic Christianity, Protestant Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, or others. Or in some new community as yet to be created, or by individuals without specific community connections. This universal application, in my view, gives it a genuine claim to the term Catholic. For the first time in history, we now have an understanding of man so comprehensive and fundamental that it can be the basis for a unification of the world, first religiously and culturally, and in time, politically. When enough individuals are carriers of the consciousness of wholeness, the world itself will become whole. Let me summarize. New myth tells us that each individual ego is a crucible for the creation of consciousness and a vessel to serve as a carrier of that consciousness. That is, a vessel for the incarnation of the Holy Spirit. The individual psyche is the equivalent of the Holy Grail. Consciousness is a psychic substance which is produced by the experience of the opposites, suffered not blindly, but in living awareness. This experience is the conjunctio, the mysterium conjunctionis, that generates the philosopher's stone symbolizing consciousness. Each individual, to a greater or lesser extent, is a participant in cosmic creation. Each one is one of the buckets of that great Manichaean wheel of light. who contributes his widow's mite to the cumulative treasury of the archetypal psyche realized. Every human experience, to the extent that it is lived in awareness, augments the sum total of consciousness in the universe. This fact provides the meaning for every experience and gives each individual a role in the ongoing world drama of creation. Thank you. I'm not going to take that personally. I thought we might have a brief break, and then if there are any questions, it might be more expeditious if you were to write them out, and I would read the ones I thought I could answer, and then say a word about them. First of all, a number of people have asked me if this paper is available, copies of it are available, and they aren't yet. However, it's going to be published in Quadrant, the journal of the CG Jung Foundation in New York City, and the best way to get a copy of this paper is to write the CG Jung Foundation, 28 East 39th Street, New York City 10016, requesting a copy of Quadrant containing the paper, the new myth meaning, and they'll send it to you when it's published. It'll either be published in the next issue or the subsequent one. I'm not sure which yet. Now, there are a number of interesting and challenging questions here, and I think I'm obliged to take some of the less challenging ones just for the sake of self-preservation. Let me go through a few, and the ones I don't refer to, if individuals feel pretty strongly about it, come up to me alone afterwards, and I'll try to stammer something out to them, but I wouldn't feel comfortable to stammer too obviously to the whole group. One question I'm taking just a fraction from inquires about the concept of evil and the experience of the negative in the new myth of meaning. That is something that warrants a little enlargement. The whole idea of the union of opposites is so very difficult to convey unless one has specific experiences that one can point to. Otherwise, it's just an abstraction. But what makes the union or the encounter with the opposites so terribly painful is the bad, negative, evil side of the opposites. We don't have any trouble in carrying good. We don't have any trouble in feeling ourselves worthy and happy and successful and with freely flowing energy. What we have trouble in carrying is the experience of worthlessness, of being miserable, damnable sinners in the old way of expressing it. In other words, in carrying consciousness of the shadow. And therefore, in all experiences where the opposites come up, what we will be most aware of is the negative dimension of it. The good side we tend to take for granted. That's not universally true, but there are a few people for whom the reverse is the case. But by and large, that's the case. And it's what justifies the experience of depression, for instance. The whole phenomenon called the dark night of the soul, and the whole descent into the unconscious, which one can't see where he's going, and feels lost and helpless and worthless because he's so impotent. All those experiences belong to the union of opposites, but the dark side is the one most in view, just because it's the one we try not to look at so much. So when it finally comes, it's the only one we can see. But it's the prelude to the awareness of the opposites, and therefore belongs to the phenomenology of emerging consciousness. And to be able to keep that perspective and that realization in the midst of a dark period is very helpful. I understood you to say the unconsciousness of God needs more awareness of Him. Did I hear correctly, and would you elaborate? Of course, when things are put so boldly, there's an outrageous quality to them that one can't help but question. For instance, how can one presume to make such a observation that God is unconscious? Well, I wasn't the first one to do it. Jung was. But I'm not just following him blindly. I also have evidence for the same phenomenon, but I am awfully glad Jung went ahead of me. I don't think I'd have the courage to say it on my own. If one puts it a little differently, it becomes more palatable. If one says we need to pay more attention to the unconscious to get to know the unconscious better, because that is a benefit to it. That's not so hard to take. That's almost self-evident. But you see, when one is speaking empirically, not philosophically or abstractly, but empirically, talking about living psychic reality, then one can no longer make a distinction between God and the unconscious, because the God, or the God image, which is all we're talking about, the God image is encountered in the unconscious as the deepest and ultimate manifestation of the unconscious. And when you realize that empirically is what is meant when Jung talks about the unaware or the unconscious God, then you see at least where he's coming from. He's coming from an empirical, experiential position. He's just describing the fact that he's observed. And those that want to speculate about a God completely beyond human experience, well, they won't have anything to do with psychology, because psychology, as I think of it anyway, is empirical. And maybe that elaboration will help make the outrageous remark a little more palatable. But there is truly a reality beyond the idea, and if it's objected to, then it might be an occasion for further reflection and may lead to new awarenesses. Those of you that are really interested in this idea of the unconsciousness of God should read or reread Answer to Job. It's all there, and it's an absolutely magnificent work. You know, Jung is said to have said that Answer to Job is his only work that he was completely satisfied with. Do you anticipate an external and material parallel to the dreams of destruction of New York? And how are you personally preparing for such possibility? Well, I wouldn't rule it out. All I'm doing is doing my best to live my own life every day as well as I know how. I don't know anything else to do. And I'll let those other things take care of themselves. I feel that my sphere of influence is extremely limited indeed, and it's all I can do to keep myself straight. And I don't feel like building bomb shelters or anything like that. But I would think of that as a concretization or exteriorization of the problem. On the other hand, I'm an introvert, so naturally I would try to deal with such things internally, and an extrovert might take the reverse position and be equally right. So that's all I can say about that. Here's a rather interesting thought. Why do you think that Jung is the first one? Why not Hegel? thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and his speaking of God's evolving self. I do feel that Jung gave Hegel a rather short shrift. He didn't like Hegel. The reason he didn't like him was that I don't know what this is based on him, but he was convinced that he was a pompous ass. And his arrogance evidently was so offensive to Jung that he didn't pay much attention to the ideas as such. But I think somebody is going to do a doctoral dissertation. I had somebody that was going to do that a while back, and she chickened out at the last minute and took another course. But somebody in this academic audience, I want to throw that out. This is crying to be done. Jung and Hegel, a doctoral dissertation, because Hegel does kind of foreshadow many of the realizations of depth psychology, but abstractly, so to speak. And the reason he's not the first one is because that he didn't live. He didn't live the images he gave expression to. Jung did. I'm sort of inundated. I've got more than I can manage here. One of these asked, how can one promote the new myth? And I think there was some suggestion that maybe there could be some gatherings that could get together and promote it some way. That may not be fair to that question because I don't remember for sure. But my response to that, the way to promote it, if you were at all fired or excited by the image I presented, what I mean to convey and what I think is the way of promoting it is serious, earnest, devoted working on yourself and what goes on within and immediately around you. Not what goes on in the world at large or in larger political or social or collective forms, but what goes on immediately and directly influenceable by you, because that's where individual consciousness operates, and that's where the augmentation of consciousness is going to take place through the agency of numerous individual vessels filling up themselves through their own efforts. As I'm fond of saying in alchemical talks, the alchemical opus was never performed by a committee. And we in America in particular, I think, whenever we get a new idea, say let's get a new group, let's get a committee, and work on how to make it a reality. This is an individual task, as I understand it.
Excuse me, ask the question I think perhaps probably misunderstood. What I meant to ask was perhaps how will this come about? And
would you stand up? Because oh, there you are. Okay.
I meant to ask primarily how, for those of us who see this new mythology forming, do you have any ideas as to how it's going to evolve? And I guess I was primarily wondering what is your opinion compared to mine? And I think there are probably a number of other people around here who also foresee this new mythology forming and would also like to hear your ideas on how it's going to evolve.
Yeah. I wouldn't dare say. I've already transgressed my own limits of propriety by what I've told you today. I already feel that I've made something more explicit than is quite ready to take place.